This is the third video in the series on podcast directories, and in today's video I'm going to show you how to submit your podcast to Apple Podcasts. So let's get started. Hello and welcome to TPU TV. This is Dilip. If you're new here and don't know me, then I'm a blogger, podcaster and affiliate marketer. And this is a channel where I share a lot of the simple, practical and implementable podcasting tips so that you can get started with your own podcast. And if you're new to podcasting and want to get started with your own podcast, then you can join my free 10-day e-course on how to start a podcast. You'll be able to find that at thepodcastinguniversity.com/free-guide. You'll be able to find a link in the description box below. Go ahead, click the link and join the course today and get started with your own podcast in 10 days. Now with that out of the way, today's video is going to be a practical submission video where I'm going to show you how to submit your podcast to Apple Podcasts. Apple Podcast submission is a little tricky, but I'll show you how to go about the step-by-step process so that it is easier for you to submit your podcast to Apple Podcasts. So let's get onto my desktop and see how the process works. Okay, so here I am on the Podcast Connects page for Apple Podcast. I will leave the link in the description. You can go and check the link. It is basically podcastconnect.apple.com. Now, before I get into showing you how to submit your podcast to Apple Podcasts, let me show you this quick note from Apple Podcasts for creators. Now, this is a page where they talk about what exactly Apple Podcasts Connect is. They clearly say here what are the things that you can do with Apple Podcasts Connect. You can join the Apple Podcasters program. You can set up your show for a subscription. You can group your shows together with channels. You can set up a subscription promotion for your show or channel. You can view the status of the podcast. So there are quite a few things that you can do with your podcast, which isn't available with a lot many other podcast directories. Now, I'll show you why you have so many things or so many options that you have on Apple Podcast Connect, because there is one additional feature that Apple Podcasts gives you, which not a lot of the other service providers or podcast directories will give you. But first, let me quickly show you how to go about submitting your podcast to Apple Podcasts. So here is the link. You can just click on this link and it will take you to the link where you can submit your podcast. I'm already on that page. I already have an account, so I'm going to use that account. You will need an Apple ID. If you don't have one, you can go and create one. You can see here is a link. You can click on this link and create an account for you. So let me first quickly log in to my account. Now it will ask for a two-factor authentication. You might be required to set up a two-factor authentication just from a security perspective, which is something that I would recommend that you do. You will have to enter that code here and it will let you log in. Now I'm logged into my Apple Podcasts Connect page. You can see here, these are the two podcasts that I have on this account. The Affiliate Marketing Simplified podcast, which is what I showed you the last week on Spotify as well. This podcast is something that I had done about 4 years back, a limited version of the podcast, just about 49 odd episodes. This is a podcast that I'm continuing with right now, the Podcasting University, where I share podcasting tips. Now let me quickly show you how to go about submitting your podcast. You can see here there is a plus button. So when you click on the plus button, it will give you two options, new channel and new show. The new channel option is for you to create a channel where you can group multiple podcasts together and give your listeners an option to listen to all of these podcasts on your particular channel. Now, for example, if you are a provider or a network, you can use this option. But what we are going to do is we are going to submit a new show or a new podcast. So you click this option, which is new show. Here it gives you two options. This is exactly what I was talking about a little while back. Now Apple gives you an option of adding a show with an RSS feed and also without an RSS feed. Now here you might want to be very careful about what this is all about. You can see here it mentions your show will only be available on Apple Podcasts. This is the best option if you want to manage episodes in Apple Podcasts Connect and offer a subscription. Now this is the option where you can host your podcast on Apple Podcasts and also use their subscription option. Now we already have our podcast hosted on a different podcast hosting platform. So we are going to use this option, which is add a show with an RSS feed. So we click on next. It will bring you to a page which will ask to add an RSS feed. So let me quickly grab the RSS feed for the podcast that I'm going to submit. I have my RSS feed with me, so I'm going to paste the RSS feed here, and now I click on add and it will say processing and it will bring me to this page which shows the podcast information or the show information. You can see here the show information is showing as draft because it is not yet published. Now you have some of these options, but most of these are not editable on Apple Podcasts because you're hosting your podcast with a third-party podcast host. That's why you're not able to do a lot of these things here. Even once the processing is complete, there isn't much that you will be able to change here. All that you can do is just set these options. This show does not contain third-party content. You'll be able to put your contact details here if that is something that you want to show, and then you click on save and the data will be saved. Now, some of the other options that you have here is to see the availability of the podcast. You can see here which regions or which countries the podcast is available. What is the distribution status? If you want to make it available for distribution, if you uncheck it, it'll give you this pop-up box which says remove show from distribution. The show will no longer be available for distribution through the Apple Podcast catalog, which is something, if you want to do it, you can always do that. And once that is done, there are options of transcripts, which is something new. Transcripts is something that Apple Podcasts has added very recently. So your podcast will also have a transcript of its own, and that is helpful in an added distribution. So ensure that you are enabling this. It says only display auto-generated transcripts, display transcripts I provide, or auto-generated transcripts by Apple if one isn't provided. So you might want to select this so that you are able to provide a transcript for the episode, because you never know if the auto-generated transcript is right or not. So you might want to ensure that this is selected. Show release the show as soon as it's published, or you can select a date when you want to release the show. For example, let me say I'm going to release this show somewhere in February 15th. So let me keep it that way, and then I click on save, and this show will be released on the 15th of April. Now, another option that you have is to go to subscription, and there you'll be able to see some of the other things, like for example offering subscription, and it is clearly mentioned here, subscriptions let you offer listeners special features like early access, subscriber only and archived episodes. And to include multiple shows in one subscription, you will need to create a channel. So that is something that you can do here, which is a paid subscription, which means people will pay to listen to your podcast. And finally, here it is going to be the ratings and reviews for your podcast episode. So submitting your podcast to Apple Podcast is that simple. Now it is going to take some time before this changes from draft to published. So you will want to wait for some time, and if there are any issues, then you might get an email from Apple Podcast asking you to provide further information or further clarification on those issues. But in most of the cases, this usually gets accepted. So that is how you submit your podcast to Apple Podcasts Connect. I hope you found this video helpful. I had released a video on how to submit your podcast to Spotify the last week, so you'll be able to see that in the I button. Go ahead and check that out if you want to see how to submit your podcast to Spotify. I hope you enjoyed this video and you found value in what I shared, and now you'll be able to submit your podcast to Apple Podcasts. If you have any questions, don't forget to drop them in the comment box below. I'll respond to all of that. And if you like this video, then do give this video a thumbs up, because that'll help a lot of the others benefit from this video, find this video and benefit from it. So don't forget to do that. And if you're new here and you enjoyed watching the information that I shared, then do subscribe to this channel and hit the bell notification, because that way you will stay updated with all of the latest videos that I release. That's all that I have for today's video. I'll be back again the next week with another interesting discussion around podcasting. Until then, keep watching TPU TV. This is goodbye from Dilip.